Share, share my screen here. Up underneath of this thing to say play. Okay, just do this. There. Everybody see that? Good. Okay. Yeah, great. Thank you. So firstly, I want to say thank you to the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture for inviting me in. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm in a location I'm not used to and not sure how the sound is working, but okay, good. So the fact that you all showed up, I'm not sure how many of you are here, but that sends a message. And I would say that message is you care about your health, that you want to learn more of how to be healthier and be more aware of the stress that you may be experiencing in your life. We all have some level of stress. Sometimes we think it's all bad, but stress is necessary, it's needed, it helps motivate us, it helps keep us safe, and all of those good things. So today we're going to be building on whatever awareness you already have and focusing on your own leadership role in improving your health and taking care of yourself, because we are ultimately responsible for ourselves. Unfortunately, nobody's coming for us. Nobody's coming to help things to be better. So we need to take charge of that and take those steps to become more aware of what's impacting us and how to make better choices for our own health and wellness. One of the things I think that we don't often talk about in relation to mental health and stress is the courage to do things differently. A lot of us don't understand that courage is required to take self-care actions. And so asking for help, like in taking breaks at work, resting, looking after our emotional needs, is sometimes perceived as self-indulgent. I'm not sure if people have heard that before, but in my work, that arises a lot. When people are taking care of themselves, there's sometimes a little voice that comes in that says they're being selfish or they're letting other people down because they should always be available, they should always be working. And so sometimes those feelings arise and then we choose not to take that break or not make that doctor's appointment or not get that extra sleep that we need because we're too busy and we keep going. Historically, most of us, I shouldn't say most, but many of us have been taught to push emotions down. I had a client once tell me, a male client tell me that since he was a little boy, he remembers being told that those emotions and expression of feelings or needs were silenced by those around him. And he described it like pouring concrete down his throat, right? Like really just pushing everything down so that he could continue to go through. And that image just stayed in my mind, and working with a lot of people over the last 20 years, I would say that is definitely a theme. I've heard that a lot of people unable to express themselves without fear of judgment, because many of us have been programmed to just get back on that horse and keep going. And yes, we need to, but sometimes we need a little bit of help. When we need help, sometimes we experience an emotion called shame. We don't talk about shame very much. A lot of us don't even understand what shame is or how it shows up for us. But shame is a very intense emotion that makes us feel sometimes that we're not enough, that there's something wrong with us, that we aren't able to cope, or that we're having a difficult time. And sometimes our brain tells us that everybody else has it together and everybody else is good, but there's something wrong with us. There's just, we're not quite right. And so that feeling can keep us from taking action to take care of ourselves or to ask for help because we feel shame. Shame is when your cheeks get really red or your throat gets tight or you feel sick to your stomach or your mind starts racing. And that's how sometimes it shows up in our bodies. And so recognizing that response is really, really important. We all need to know how shame shows up so we can recognize it and make a different choice that might be more helpful to our health. To understand the difference, because there is a big difference between shame, the emotion of shame, and guilt. Guilt is more motivating. So you might feel guilty that you're not calling your mom and dad enough, or you didn't do certain things, and maybe you would like to improve that. So guilt can be a little bit more motivating. Shame, on the other hand, is a focus on yourself. Like, I'm not enough. Who I am isn't enough. I'm broken versus the behavior. So shame is a focus on self. Guilt is more a focus on an action, a behavior. So that's really important to know the difference between those two. And I think that, when I think about we talk, we grow, I think about the shame that's tied to talking, the shame that's tied to admitting things are hard. And I think that's a place where we need to start, is to understand the physiological responses to shame and how that's linked to farmers, because farmers are resilient, right? Farmers are strong, they're tough, they're able to keep going. And so when we have to ask for help, sometimes farmers feel shame about that because they're the fixers, they're the doers, they're the ones we can rely on. And so to be able to say, hey, I need a little bit of help, we can understand why that's such a struggle. So we need to know what shame is in order to override it and to know that there's not something wrong with you when we need help. It's not a part that you are broken. People are not broken. People don't need to be fixed. People need to have some awareness of how these things affect us so that they can make a different decision. So just making sure folks on the line know that this is not a clinical session. This is an information session, an education session. Although I am a clinician, that's not why I'm here today. My role today is to bring awareness and offer some tools that you can take away, some practical tools to help you all feel better and do better. I think we hear a lot about resilience, and sometimes people think resilience is just a way to blame the victim. So the person who's been affected is the one who always has to become strong and to bounce back and to fix things. And sometimes we can feel, well, why us? why do we have to do all of that work? Why do we have to be exploring the problems and the solutions? What about everyone else? What about the systems that are broken? When we become hurt, when we've had something happen to us, either physically or emotionally or mentally, or by institutions, sometimes we can get locked in that sense of injustice. We get stuck in the thing that happened or the thing that we can't fix, the uncontrollable. And oftentimes we can spend time ruminating over those things that we aren't able to fix. And quite simply put, and not to sound harsh, but the world isn't going to change. We need to be the change for ourselves. That doesn't mean we give up on advocating and working towards the things that we're trying to work towards. But when we get stuck in the injustices and the things that we are not able to change, that are outside of our control, that's when illness can settle in. That's that stress of not being able to fix something. And I may mention men in particular a couple of times today, Not that women aren't also experiencing the same, but men in particular, historically, have been identified as fixers, problem solvers. So sometimes with that historical role, if they cannot fix something, that brings shame. So we have to understand that some things are not fixable, and the only thing within our control is ourselves and how we respond to stress. One of the things I think that's important that we understand is that we can only know what we know. That sounds so simple, but there was a time that I was unaware of my own stress responses, and I wasn't fully informed or had fully done the work myself to recognize my own triggers. And so I was on a journey to figure that out, even as a mental health clinician. Today, I still have a lot to learn. Yesterday, I needed to learn some things a few years ago and a few years ago. This whole journey of life is about learning and accepting there's things that we don't know, leaning into that and figuring out what do we need to know? What is going to help us to be better and do better for ourselves and for our families? I personally am a bit of an achiever, so I like to achieve goals. I like to be really good at my work. And sometimes that ambition can cloud things. Sometimes my tendency to perfect can cloud things. And so we're going to go over some of those signs and symptoms that when stress arises, our response can either help us or can make things worse. And for a recovering perfectionist, I'd like to say, still in recovery, learning those signs, continuing to learn those signs throughout our journey because they change is important if we're going to be able to take care of our health. So if we are not able to recognize those signs and implement tools to take care of ourselves, we can be at risk of burning out. That meaning there's not much left in the tank to deal with anything. And that's not a place most of us would like to get to. Very low distress tolerance. So when something goes wrong, we have little in the tank to deal with it. We can become very angry, impatient. We can overfunction with certain things, or we can underfunction. So myself personally, having been in an environment that was constantly changing, my lack of awareness of how I was responding to stress led me down that path of burnout. And it was compounded, the shame that arose in me when I wasn't able to keep going as a mental health clinician was even more compounded because I'm supposed to know these things, right? So it was very difficult for me to actually say, hey, I need some help over here. I'm not doing okay. And so that was my learning journey. And that's tied to what I said earlier. We don't know what we don't know. And if we haven't been in certain situations, we're not really sure how we're going to respond to them. And it's our job to learn from it and do better next time. For me, going back to that rumination part, when I became unwell, I ruminated about all of the things that were wrong, all of the things that other people were doing, all of the things I couldn't fix, which actually kept me from working on me. It kept me focused on what other people were doing wrong or what the institution was doing wrong, what the leadership was doing wrong, and all the things that needed to be fixed versus what I could do for myself. How could I show up for myself better? I didn't have that wisdom at the time. That came after. And now I get to share that story, a little bit of that story, to help people understand how that can show up in their lives when they don't know something. That's what these presentations are for, to help people recognize they're not alone. And you can't know what you didn't know before today. Learning new ways to recognize and adapt to those uncontrollable forces in our lives, because we all have uncontrollable forces in our lives, is what's going to help prevent stress, prevent injuries and accidents, and improve our quality of life. One of the things that we don't recognize is that we're often in an autopilot state. Autopilot meaning something happens and we're instantly reacting to it, our automatic stress response. If we're not tuned into our own behavior, our own thoughts and feelings, we often don't recognize that we're on autopilot. And we're all guilty of going into autopilot. It's a natural human state that we go into, especially when things go wrong. The brain starts going and we start reacting. For some of us, sometimes that means we can blame others when things go wrong and not look at what our role might be. We may engage in substance use to deal with stress. When stress arises, we may engage in all kinds of behaviors to kind of avoid that. So I see a lot of internet use, distracting. I see a lot of scrolling. I see a lot of shopping. We see a lot of disconnection, just trying to numb out from that pain, which ends up making it worse. Very human responses. Humans don't like pain. We like to avoid it at all costs. We like to avoid physical and emotional pain. And as I spoke about earlier, that shame, that would be an example of pain. That would be an example of emotional pain that we don't want to feel. So here we are asking people to come forward and talk and share when that's one of the most painful things. So first, we have to understand why it's painful to do that, and then help give people the tools to be able to respond in a more intentional, self-aware way versus the autopilot. So there's our auto responses. And then as we learn and grow, we're able to become more aware that there's a different choice that we can make. So there's a difference between reacting and responding. If we're not able to take care of ourselves, there's a good chance we're in a reactive state where we're not really responding thoughtfully to things. We're reacting to things. These are some of those responses I was just talking about. The substance use. Sometimes we can intentionally harm others, or we can be the receiver of that. I'm not sure if anyone's been in a workplace where somebody tends to discharge their anger onto other people and blame people for things and aren't able to recognize their role in that. I use myself as an example sometimes. I can be an over-functioner or an under-functioner. And what that means is when I'm in a stressful situation, I can try and perfect things, go over and over and over things, and really waste a lot of time, not be efficient, and really use a lot of energy to try and prevent shame. Prevent feeling that shame, because if I can get it right and I can perfect it, then I won't get it wrong and I won't feel ashamed. So all of that energy goes into perfecting things. So we're making little progress with what we're trying to do. Avoidance, like I said, the scrolling, shopping, using things external to ourselves to control that stress, versus going inside and thinking. When I say inside, I mean in yourself, and thinking, How am I perceiving things? Is there something I can augment and think differently about? Am I making some things up? Because our brain is very, very powerful. It takes a few facts and then sometimes fills in the rest. And so we have to be very careful about what is the story? What is the story we're telling ourselves about this situation? What is fact? And what might be confabulation? Confabulation is kind of a big word for saying lies told honestly. Confabulation is that way we came out of our office or out of the barn, or somebody looked at us and gave us a bit of a look and then went on their way, and we might go in our minds and say, oh geez, he's really angry at us, I think, and we make up a story about what that interaction just was. And then that story, if it fits with what we believe to be true, like that everybody's angry at us or something like that, if it fits that narrative, then we believe it. Our brain goes, oh yeah, that's right, they're really angry at you, you did something wrong. And then our brain gives us a little dopamine hit and it reconfirms that to us, that, oh yeah, that must be the case. And here we are making decisions and we're having cortisol, the stress hormone, flooding our bodies, or adrenaline, based on the story that we've made up that might not be true. So we have to be really, really mindful and aware of how powerful the brain is, and that it does make up stories. And it's our job to get really clear on what are those facts and what are the confabulations, because it directly relates to how our brain releases hormones and chemicals and then affects our heart, everything, our whole body. It all comes down to the thoughts. Forgetting, being distracted, sleep, appetite, activities, all of those pieces are affected. Lack of energy, avoidance through distraction, feeling hopeless and depressed, self-blame and anger. These are all examples of automatic stress responses. We need to move from that automatic response into more of a awareness, slowing down, taking more time. And I know as soon as I say that, I immediately go to the farm and think, time? What do you mean take time, right? Because often there isn't a lot of time. We're trying to get through the days. We are all very, very busy, and especially on the farm. But if we don't take that moment, to slow down and take a breath, just do that for me for a moment. Just take a breath, just in through your nose, big breath, and out through your mouth. Just take a couple of those. I want you to just notice. And another one, in through the nose. What was that? 10 seconds? 10 seconds of taking a breath. Sometimes that's all it takes to be able to put ourselves back into a more aware state. And it slows the racing brain down of those auto responses and gives space to recognize what's happening so that we can make a different choice. And that didn't take much time. So as far as just taking a few breaths, and it's amazing because everyone that I work with people all week, every week around things like this. And every session, my clients know I force them to breathe. It sounds silly, but taking those breaths and being able to slow down helps us really connect with what matters to us, helps us connect to what we need to do next, versus that autopilot response, which is pretty much what our focus is on today. That's what's going to reduce our stress. And so that's why it's so hard to get people to change, because slowing down and breathing and taking that time goes back to, we got to keep going. Can't slow down. We're being self-indulgent, or we're not working hard enough or fast enough. Go, 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 go. Then we make mistakes. Then it builds up. Stress builds, builds, builds. And then we need a release. And sometimes that goes back to drugs, substance use, gambling, shopping, internet, whatever, disconnecting, anger, all of those ways we're trying to avoid ourselves and taking care of ourselves. So, common elements to help build resilience, self-awareness. We've heard a lot about self-awareness. It is very, very important. And if we are not self-aware, then there's a good chance we're not taking care of our health. And it's a good chance that we're impacting others in a negative way. Social connection, we all know being with people helps. We are naturally in relationship with others. We are social beings, and being with others does help reduce our stress. Anticipating those challenges that are going to arise in our lives also helps reduce our stress. And then things like this, which is developing strategies to help cope with our stress, builds our resiliency. These things all help us become stronger. And I just want to say, sometimes people think I'm not social. I don't need others. I've heard that a lot. And yes, we all have different preferences. And at the end of the day, that connection with others is needed for survival. It's not something that we get to say we don't need. All of the science and the data does demonstrate we are social beings. That's how we've got to be where we are as a species now, is through collective action to build and support each other and create families. So here's an evidence-based kind of practical way to think about stress management. And evidence-based tools are the best to use because we know it's from the data, it's from the literature, it's from the research, and this works. And sometimes we don't realize that we have to put in the work. Going back to the idea of being resilient, it's us that has to put in this work in order to improve our health. Nobody's coming for us. So we need these tools to be able to cope. So the first one we're going to explore is acceptance. Sometimes folks that I work with think acceptance just means giving up, right? People hear that word and they think it's surrendering. But again, it's accepting the things that are within our control and the things that are not within our control. Growing up on a dairy and beef farm, spring was certainly a time of stress. And one of the number one stressors, well, other than the fertilizer bills, one of the number one stressors was the weather, and always is the weather. But it's something my dad couldn't control. He couldn't control the weather. But I think sometimes this brain of ours that's so powerful keeps thinking about that thing over and over and over again, as if it's going to somehow give us some control. If we're worried about it, sometimes we think we can control it. And that's just not the case. We cannot control the weather. As great as my father is, he's not able to control the weather. None of us are. And so what we can control is recognizing that maybe we're ruminating. Maybe we're talking to ourselves about how the rain's not going to come or the rain's not going to stop. And so, again, going back to what I said earlier, that generates cortisol, that generates adrenaline and stress. And sometimes it makes us feel like we're doing something, but we're not really. We're creating more pressure. We're creating more stress on our heart and our organs, which then is affecting our quality of life. It's affecting our energy. It's affecting all of those things. But tell a farmer not to worry about the weather. I don't know if I'd get another I don't think I'd be very respected if I said that, but I need to at least let folks know, that's an example of one of those uncontrollable things. We can prepare for the weather. We can prepare, which is good. That helps. But we must accept the things we can't change. Looking at challenges as opportunities for growth and learning. This is a tough one because most of us have fear of failure. Sometimes it can be costly, but we don't try different things, or we try to hide where we make mistakes. And we don't understand that that's the only way we learn. It's the only way we grow. Like I said, we only know what we know. And the only way we've gained wisdom and knowledge, the only way is through those mistakes and reviewing. Not from a place of shame and I'm not enough and I didn't do it right, but from a place of worthiness of learning. What can I learn from this? What can I harvest? What wisdom can I harvest from these experiences that I can then apply to help myself or help others? How many of us, when we have those face down moments, say, thank you. What can I learn from this? Not many. Most of us self-flagellate. Most of us, say, oh, you should have known better. You shouldn't have done that. And there's a little voice that can come in that is that little shameful voice on the shoulder saying, hey, you screwed up. You're not enough. And then you can get stuck in that rumination. Who's that helping? How do we grow when we're the negative voice in our own head? Do things grow well in hostile environments? Not often. So it's super important to tune in to how you're talking to yourself. It matters. It affects everything. And I know from working with people for 20 years, we all think nobody knows what's going on inside your head. And yeah, to some extent, we don't. But that energy, people can feel that. You can feel that. It affects everything. If there's a lot of negative, hostile things going on in here, it's not easy to change, but awareness of it is the first step. Sharing your feelings to help reduce their power over your emotions. That's a big one. That's a big one for shame, because shame, you recall, I said, is the feeling that you're broken, there's something wrong with you. The antidote to shame is self-compassion. The antidote to I'm broken, I'm not enough is I am enough and I'm learning and I'm growing. One way keeps you locked in a prison. The other way frees you. Frees you to try, to do better, to feel comfortable, to make mistakes and learn. The other one keeps us locked in silence, keeps us quiet. And on another point to shame, I want folks to know the emotion of shame is highly correlated with substance use disorders, eating disorders, chronic health problems, chronic pain, mental illness, and suicide. Shame is. That's why I talk about it. Because if we don't know what we feel shame about, we don't know how it shows up in our body, like I spoke about earlier with the tight throat or the sick to your stomach or the brain's racing or you want to hide. If you don't understand that, you're going to keep doing it because you don't understand why. It's important to understand shame, how we carry it, because it comes from generations. It's not just us. It comes from generations that didn't understand it before and we're working real hard to avoid it. So sometimes we feel like it's our fault we don't know. But again, we don't know till we know. And now all of you know. So you can't leave this session and say you didn't know shame. You didn't understand it before. Now you know a little bit more about it. I encourage folks to do their own research too. And try and think how it's showing up in your life. What are you ashamed of? Sometimes it's body shame. I'm ashamed of my body. Parenting shame. I'm not enough for my kids. I'm not doing enough. Financial shame. Having a hard time to make ends meet. There's so many ways that we feel shame. And if we don't recognize it, we're going to have a hard time to override the shame, add some self-compassion and some understanding so that we can do better instead of being locked in the shame and the pain. Learning to forgive others, tough one. That's a really, really tough one in acceptance is that, and people might have a hard time with this one. I usually have to work with people a long time before we can get to this place, but it helps you if you understand that people are doing the best they can with what they know. And sometimes what we've been taught might not be helpful. Sometimes the things we know aren't evidence-based ways of responding in healthy ways. Giving yourself a little bit of grace, giving others a little bit of grace. I know this personally, having gone through the burnout, people judging and assuming a lot of things and making up a lot of things about what my experience was because they just don't know. And I had to come to a place of acceptance that I know. And everybody's on their own journey to figuring that out. And a little bit of grace for yourselves and self-compassion for yourself will allow you to give that to others more freely. But if this is a hostile environment up here, it's a good chance that what comes out and how we behave is also hostile. So accepting the things and the people you really can't change is a huge piece to reducing our stress. Avoiding unnecessary stressors. When I was creating the presentation, I was thinking, oh, there are so many things that people just don't have control over. And there's so many things that we maybe don't recognize are unnecessary. And the top one here is one I work a lot with people on. It's probably 80% of my work is how to put yourself first, how to say no, how to set boundaries with others so that you have time to take care of yourself. And we can set boundaries and still be kind. I would love to help you. And I have this other commitment. I can't. No, I'm not able to do that. I don't have the energy. I care about you and no. So we can set boundaries clearly and with respect, and that's going to help create space for our own health. Most of us are doing for others constantly, again, because we find it difficult to do for ourselves. Avoiding people who create stressful environments wherever possible. Establish low stress workspaces. Prioritize your to-do list and dropping tasks and activities that aren't truly necessary. This is all very unique how we do this because everybody's situation is different. Alter the external situation, modifying your environment if possible. Not always possible. Most of the people I work with can't really change the people or the environment very much. So, like I said at the beginning, most of the change has to come within ourselves and how we think about things and the things that we are, again, might be confabulating and making up about a situation. Changing your routines, including what you consume, how you move, what you watch, and where you go. A lot of times people don't realize the news, even just something as simple as that. Compulsively watching the news can generate a lot of stress, a lot of worry. That might be one thing that we set down that can improve your quality of life. That's a small example. Maybe we're just going to check the news once a day instead of, 4 or 5 times a day. Setting boundaries in your relationships. That's a huge one. Adapting your internal thought processes. Reframing problems as a desired solution. I don't sleep enough, reframed as I need to improve my quality of sleep. One of those is more self-flagellating and negative, and I don't sleep enough, it's not good enough, versus I need to get more sleep. And setting that goal. A lot of us stay in the complaining and in the loop of I'm not. We need to take more action, become more self-aware, less talking about the things we need to do, and sometimes a little more action. Considering the potential consequences of taking various actions and looking at the big picture. I do a lot of work with people around values and identifying their values. And I think most of us could probably say that we don't value blaming people. We don't value anger. We don't value disconnection. But a lot of us are operating that way because we're on the autopilot, not because we want to, but because that's how we've been programmed to operate. Once we wake up to that programming and become a little more aware of those unconscious responses we're having throughout the day, and we can become more aware, that's when we make different choices. Not all the time. We're going to fail lots of times, but it's in the practice of making decisions and actions in alignment with our values, not in the perfection, not perfecting it, but practicing and failing. Setting clear and reasonable expectations and standards for yourself is another major one for helping reduce stress. Like I said earlier, I'm a bit of a perfectionist and overfunctioner, and my standards can become really, really high, and then I never reach them, and then I feel bad. How's that helpful? How is that reducing stress? It's not. I'm creating it myself, generating it. So self-monitoring. So that's a little tool that can help us all, a practical tool that can help us all become more aware of what is available to us. Because I feel like a lot of us get to this point where we think we can't do anything, right? Or it has to be a big radical change, something major. When in fact, some of these things are just ways we're thinking and perceiving things. I'm not saying there aren't major stressors that are like these things are real, 100%. But we need to be able to come back to the little ways we can feel better and do better for ourselves and our families and our workplaces and our communities. I think, I don't know the quote, I'm not going to say a quote and get it wrong, but it's, we have to be that change. Right? We want the world to change. We want this to change. We want that to change. We're in relationships. We want them to change. It's them, not us. right? It's them. Well, you know what? We need to look inside a little bit. We need to think about the ways we can change. And I'm just going to quickly go through this one. This is just another practical tool I wanted to leave you all with today, and I thought it kind of aligned well with farming. I'm doing a clinical training right now with a lady called Tara Brach, Brach. She does a lot of mindfulness teaching. She's a psychologist and a kind of a Buddhist psychologist and a meditation teacher. So this one is good to keep in mind just because rain, I think about rain when I'm thinking about farming. I think about the importance of it and how we need it. Well, this is in alignment with that. We need to be able to recognize when we're hooked by something like shame. I'll use shame again as an example. So we feel it in our body, we feel the throat, we feel the thing going on. So we're recognizing something's happening to us. That's really important. That's the awareness piece. I'm triggered. You hear people talk about triggers all the time. Okay, well, you've been triggered. Let's not just stay there, right? Let's not just stay there. I've been triggered. Let's actually allow it to happen, right? That's the next step, is allowing it. Most of us will deny it. We're feeling it, then we go and do something else to get it to go away. So we don't learn about what's actually going on. So we need to be able to allow what's happening to happen. I want you to start thinking about emotions and the physiological response to stress as data. It's data. It's important data. This whole system is a data machine. Our job is to decode it, to figure out what is going on. So recognizing it, allowing it to happen, and then the investigation, right? Why am I feeling this way? Figuring out what happened to make that response happen. Become curious. Collect the data so that you can make a good decision. And part of that investigation that's critical is the fact versus confabulation piece. What's real? What is fact? What can you verify? And what are you making up? And I know nobody likes to think they're making stuff up, but our brain, again, is very powerful. So we have to be able to discern those two things, fact versus confabulation. My boss is really mad at me. Are they? Or did something happen at home and they weren't even thinking about you? Right? And then nurture. That goes back to the not flagellating yourself or beating yourself or mentally saying you shouldn't feel this way or you shouldn't be doing that. And I talk about shoulding all over yourself versus applying compassion, nurture, and self-care. And when you hear self-care, I want you to remember that you are doing the best you can with what you know, and to try and find ways to create less hostile environments in here will help you regulate and will help your relationships if we can nurture. If it's hostile in here, it's usually hostile that's coming out here, or the actions are hostile. The change is in here. The change is how we are creating the environment in our minds to something nurturing, something we're a place where things can grow and not hostile, not anger, not violence. That is human behavior. And it's our job to figure out, where do we want to be in this human behavior, in alignment with our values, kindness, compassion, clarity, or are we going to be aligned with our anger, our confabulations, our resentment, and our jealousies? those kind of dark stuff. So we have to choose. Are we nurturing or are we harming? And I will stop there because one of the biggest things I struggle with is giving so much information in a short period of time. And I have to stop talking sometimes and just create some space for questions. And I really hope that people learn something new today, or I helped create some insight for yourselves to help reduce some of that stress and create more awareness so that you can be healthier. And the most powerful thing that we can do is lead by example and take care of ourselves. Other people will notice that and be curious about it. That is the most powerful thing we can do. And I invite you all to set some of those self-care goals for the new year. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patricia. I'm just going to stop recording now, and then we can open it for some discussion.